We're just going to be waiting 2 more minutes and then we're going to get started.
Everybody outside. Who am I passing it to?
Okay, Neil, I'll let you go.
Okay, Ma. Okay.
Yeah, if you could mute your computers. Thank you. Thanks, Brad. Okay, I'm going to get this recording started. Okay, I want to thank everybody for coming to the Finance Committee, the Joint Finance and Finance Advisory Committee meeting. It is February 10th at 7 p.m. We have all of our council members, except Councilman Rock, who has asked me to actually read a statement. He has to be out of town. Before we begin the meeting, I just want to introduce, I emailed the mayor and council that we have 2 new advisory committee appointments. One is in attendance and one is on Zoom. So Deb Sharon and Neutralia Hobbs are excellent additions to this committee, and we want to thank them very much for their service to the community. They have extensive finance experience on their resumes, and we're really excited to have them to be a part of this. This meeting is to discuss the draft budget that will be forwarded to council for approval. The one thing that I do want to ask anybody, if they are speaking, to please speak into your microphones between the masks and the Zoom. It's hard for everybody to hear on the Zoom and in the audience, from what I understand. So just to begin, Council or the finance committee at the end of the last meeting asked the mayor to please revise the budget to lower the expenses around $2 million so we can have a balanced budget. The mayor did do some revision. He increased revenue $1 million, which was for our ARPA funding that we knew was coming, and some other small revenues that could be expected, and increased expenses another $50,000. I'm disappointed that this is not a balanced budget as this committee has requested it to be. At this point, this committee is going to have to do the work and actually balance it. I have spoken to different committee members and some of the advisory committee as well about some ideas, and I think I came up with a solid plan. The mayor's budget displays using all of our reserves, except our prudent reserve, which is about 15% of our overall budget. This is not sustainable going forward. I think that council and this committee especially would love to do everything that the mayor proposed in his budget. I think a lot of it can be attainable over the next couple of years, but we really need a strategy going forward on how to be able to do that effectively and efficiently, especially because our revenues are more or less flat at this point. Before I discuss each of the proposed adjustments, Councilman Rock actually wanted me to read a statement since he could not be here. He said he'd like to start off by saying that one of the important roles of City Council is to oversee the city's finances on behalf of the residents. It is the council that has a fiduciary responsibility. Our community elects us to represent them and to protect their hard-earned dollars. The mayor has a vision for the city. I admire his vision and I'm excited about the forward momentum. However, his vision over the next 4 years is aggressive. I'm sure all of us in this room can agree that these ideas will be explored collaboratively. Over the course of the next 4 years, it's quite possible that most of this vision can be implemented after it's been fully vetted through the committee process. The mayor is proposing a budget that has a substantial deficit spend. I'm not at all surprised by this. Of course, the administration wants to submit a proposal with their forward full-term vision all in year one. It only makes sense that the leader of the community would want to implement their vision in the first year of the new term. However, I would like to caution that implementing all of these new projects at once, without a full discussion at the committee level, would be unwise and imprudent. In an effort to ward off overspending at this stage, we need to take a hard look at the overall finances.
People are saying that you shouldn't.
Everybody could just mute their phones, please, or their computers. Thank you. The mayor is proposing we deficit spend by nearly $4.5 million. This would bring our general fund ending cash balance to roughly $2.8 million. That is the absolute lowest amount of money to have in reserves that is allowed by local ordinance. If we accept this proposal, it will leave no flexibility for the future. No future administration, not even Mr. Brennan's, will ever be allowed by law to deficit spend ever again, since our cash position will be at its bare allowed minimum. As costs go up and revenues remain flat, it's almost certain that we'll not be able to maintain our minimum balance, and serious cuts will need to be made next year. It's times like now where we need to hold the administration accountable to produce a responsible budget proposal. The chairwoman and vice mayor of the city has spoken to me regarding her thoughts to get our expenses in line with revenue, and I fully support these ideas. On the issue of recycling, I agree our city can do so much better. I'd like to discuss strategies at the committee level to see how we can make a greater impact and reduce cost. The proposal that the administration is bringing forward is unique and ought to be discussed at greater length. I'm not aware of any other city that employs a dual method of pickup, both backyard and curbside. In fact, it was recommended by the trash study that we do a dual method of pickup that we do not do a dual method of pickup since it would be too costly. I asked about the possibility throughout the study of backyard rubbish pickup and curbside recycling pickup and was greeted with laughter. Being serious on the issue, I had asked that the cost be incorporated into the study. It was, and it was found to cost more money. The mayor's budget proposal proves this theory. By the numbers and according to the study, the city recycles 355 tons each year at a cost of $96 per ton. That totals $34,080. If we were to transition from bag recycling to loose recycling, we can do so at a cost of $69 per ton, or $24,495. The savings of $9,485. If we abandon recycling altogether, which I'm not recommending, we would be throwing our recycling into a landfill at a cost of $40 per ton. In an effort to save $9,500 per year, by switching from bag recycling to loose recycling, the administration is proposing we buy cans for every household in UH at a cost of $240,000. In addition to this one-time cost, 2 additional service employees would need to be hired to physically dump the contents of the curbside recycling into the recycling truck. The cost of salaries, pension, and benefits for these individuals would exceed $200,000 per year, just so we can save $9,500 per year. Does that even make sense? It sounds like government waste throwing good money at an unsolved problem. This budget proposal also includes the addition of a full-time city planner. It doesn't come as a surprise that our 2 square mile city is fully developed. It has been for many, many decades. What would this city planner actually do? Perhaps after the completion of our rezoning efforts, there may be new opportunities to redevelop areas that will be rezoned, but that hasn't happened yet. We are putting the cart before the horse here. On the issue of roads, all of our roads ought to be resurfaced every 15 to 20 years. At that rate, we should be resurfacing a half mile to 1 mile of streets per year. This year's budget proposal far exceeds this. I do not support the resurfacing of roads not to exceed the $800,000 this year. If we repave Cedar, then we don't have the funds to resurface any other road in this year's program. We have long-term needs such as new municipal facilities. Right now, the latest estimates on the new construction are $50 million. We need to think carefully how to finance this. University Heights is one of the highest tax cities in the entire state. If we spend our investments in this year's budget, then we will certainly be asking the residents to support a tax increase to finance new construction. How much more taxes can our residents endure, especially when we can't even balance a budget? I'd like to conclude with a reminder that the council has an obligation to be good stewards of the city's finances. This is not our money, but we are the keepers of the purse. It is our duty to produce a balanced budget. While we have money in our reserves, which earns interest while we determine its future important purpose, we should not be dipping into that for annual operating expenditures. Furthermore, we should not be depleting that in 1 year. I do not support spending last year's surplus this year, and if we end 2022 with a surplus, then I support including that in the 2023 budget. Before I detail some of the ideas that we could have discussion about in terms of adjustments of the budget, is there anybody that would like to say anything beforehand?
Mr. Kennedy, do you want to go over the changes that we made to the budget, and then go over, what would be left with regard to across all funds? Sure.
Mr. Kennedy, if you could just pull the microphone. Thanks.
Better?
Yeah.
Budget proposal that was submitted to the planning calling for revenue estimates of $18.4 million and expenses of $22.9 million. That's over all funds. That difference for the year was about $4.5 million. That was the basis of the original proposal that was discussed at the first finance committee meeting. Subsequently, we made adjustments based on discussions with the mayor. I believe Ms. Weiss touched on. We added in the second payment that we were due. We just don't know when it's coming in for the ARPA money, which is federal money that's coming through to the cities, states, and counties. And that was roughly $670,000. We changed the use of that money in that proposal, as was discussed briefly at the council meeting last week or
How do I?
To use the ARPA money to cover the Cedar Road resurfacing project. Mr. Cheney briefed the council on the fact that the pricing had increased rather substantially from last year. And ODOT had required the city to put up an upfront deposit of over $1 million. So originally the ARPA funding, the use of that was discussed last fall. And there was a sewer manhole addition project that was proposed. The mayor had asked that we just defer that until subsequent periods, because right now Cedar needs to be done. South Euclid is committed to putting their share this year. I believe they're borrowing money to cover their share. And in the interest of getting that particular job done before the prices rise any level beyond what they are now, we propose to use that ARPA money for the Cedar Road job. So that the original expense and partial revenue that was allocated to the street fund, that's Fund 200, was moved to the ARPA fund. So in addition to the $670,000 we expect to receive from the federal government sometime in June, is the latest I've heard. We had $670,000 that we received last year. So that total of $1.3 million would be available to use on the Cedar Road resurfacing. Just as a little background, I believe we briefed at the last meeting, the uses of the ARPA monies were revised. Originally, there were pretty stringent restrictions on that, both for cities and counties. The federal treasury changed those regulations. It has given everybody up to $10 million as an allowance to spend on regular operations. So that's why the use of those funds were then changed from the infrastructure for the sewer project to the Cedar Road resurfacing. So the additional $670,000 was added to the budget that we will receive in the summer. We also added in the expected reimbursements we'll get from the county, which is roughly $175,000, and then approximately $300,000 that we would bill to South Euclid for their share of the job. So that was the major change in the budget. And again, that called for reductions in the street fund, moving the projected expense for Cedar down into the ARPA fund, and also adjusting the revenue upward. So we added some small expenses in the general fund. The net result of all that was we reduced the difference, which they said was $4.5 million in our first proposal, to $3.45 million at the end of the day. So we would be taking in $19.7 million as opposed to spend $23.1 million. So we start out with an ending fund balance. Again, this is all funds, not just the general fund. At the end of 2021, our balance was $9.8 million. At the end of 2022, we proposed that balance would be reduced to 6.4. That's how you arrive at the $3.5 million difference there. So a portion of those monies that are being spent, I know we talked at the last meeting about, I'll give you an example. The Trademark water line project was originally scheduled for last year. Cleveland Water Department gave us $560,000. That job is not initiated or completed in 2021. So we're under an obligation to spend that money this year, but it is part of the beginning balance. So we're actually spending some of the balance. It would not be included in the revenue for this year because we already received it. Similarly, that would be the case for the $670,000 that we've already received for the ARPA money. So just for discussion purposes, the total of those two is $1.2 million. So of the $3.45 million difference in fund balance, $1.2 million of that is money that we received last year that we have to spend in 2022. So if you're just looking at revenues and expenses, you do have to take into account commitments that are part of your fund balance to begin with, because if we don't spend the money, we have to give it back. So sure everybody's clear about that when the word deficit is used. Deficit is a snapshot between the revenue and expense for the current year, but we are spending some monies that we had received last year, so it doesn't count in 2022 revenue. So with all those changes, we did reduce the difference in the differential in the fund balance went from $4.5 million to $3.45 million. So that reduced that by $1 million. Those were pretty much the major changes that were in the budget.
I'm comfortable with my earphones.
I said that's probably better.
Everybody could please mute their computer.
Yeah, no, Dennis, I think you covered it, and I think one of the things that needs to be emphasized, I think what Mr. Rock is wrong, is that under the administration's budget, we have 9.8 million across all funds going into the year, and we have 6.4
Regular earphones.
as well as the reserves that the administration brought to council and the council had.
I'm gonna go get myself.
We need to look at this historically. When I was elected 4 years ago, the previous mayor had wrote about having a $2 million surplus, $2.3 million surplus, $2.5 million surplus. And I discovered, of course, when we got here, that while we had what was a $2.5 million surplus, we had hundreds of thousands of dollars in unpaid bills. And we had, all kinds of deferred expenses, deferred maintenance. We're in a much stronger position now than we were. Back in 2020, we made a lot of severe cuts because of the pandemic. These were cuts that were done prudently because we didn't know what was coming. But in 2020, we ultimately finished the year with more than $1 billion in the black. And that is money that wasn't spent on our residents back in 2020. It's money that wasn't spent on the community back in 2020. That's money that wasn't spent in 2021 either. We went into 2021 with a carryover balance of unencumbered general fund money over $5 million. And we find ourselves in the same position now. The only difference is the value of that money's gone down. The spending power of that money has gone down. Expenses have gone up. Police cars have gone up. Pavement has gone up. And those things are going to come back down. So, when Mr. Rock and others are talking about, we don't want to spend it all at once. I mean, we were 5 years ago, in a place where we had a $2.5 million surplus. We were hundreds of thousands of dollars off of that because there were unpaid paving bills, unpaid other bills that really should have been properly taken at well below $2 million. The unencumbered general fund money is over $5 million at this point. Our reserve policy is not $5 million, it's $2.5 million. We have all this money that we have been accumulating and not spending, all this money we've been taking from the taxpayers and not returned to them in the form of services. We have all these projects that we've deferred, all these streets we haven't made, all this work that needs to be done, a lot of one-time expenses. And these are things that ought not wait and need not wait, and in fact have waited. So when Mr. Rock and others are talking about doing it over a couple of years or several years or 4 years, we've been doing this since 2020. We've been kicking these things down the road since then. And the suggestion seems to be to keep doing that. Even if we spend everything that is proposed in the budget Mr. Kennedy and I put together, we finish the year with $6.4 million across all funds. So any specter of a tax increase, nobody here is talking about a tax increase. There is no need for a tax increase. I know Mr. Rock is taking the position that we would need a 50% tax increase due to needing to somehow replenish the funds that we're spending this year. But we don't need to replenish the funds that we're spending this year. We shouldn't be carrying over 9.4 million across all funds, or 9.8 million, excuse me, across all funds into this year. And we shouldn't be carrying over a $5 million carryover when especially in inflationary times. The longer we sit on that money, the less buying power it has. Meanwhile, there are actual needs this city has, actual things that the residents want, actual things that we've all been discussing over the last year that ought to be done and need not wait.
Mayor, there's a fundamental piece that you're missing there. There's a difference between revenue and cash. Revenue, when any executive brings a budget to a board or to a council like this, no one ever brings a deficit spending budget for operating. We have many capital needs coming up in the next couple of years, even if we don't build facilities. We won't have the money there. You can't dip into your investments, into your savings for operating because it's gone. Just as an example, you have 5 staff, you have 5 new positions in here that once you hire them, they have benefits, they have increases, they never go away. We can't even afford them now. If we use all of our savings this year, there's no way we're gonna afford them next year. We have no additional revenues coming into the city in the foreseeable future. Any investments that we have need to be strategically planned out. They can't just be a one-off. You can't use all of your savings now. It's not gonna, you cannot use savings for operating year after year after year. We have engineering costs that are gonna have to be made. Even if we don't build facilities, we still need to do those studies. Those are millions of dollars. You have to have a balanced budget for operating. Capital is different, but for operating, you cannot dip into your reserves year after year. Are there any other comments before we start talking about specific?
I have a question. I just want to make sure I have the numbers correct.
Yeah, I think we just get to the things.
I just want to make sure I have the numbers correct. What was said was that under the revised budget, the new revenue number for 2022 is $19.7 million, correct?
Yes.
The new projected expense number is 23.1 million. Right?
Yes.
So that's a 3.4 deficit. Okay. So we would go from 9.8 million cash balance as of 12/31/21 to 9.8 to 6.4 2022 12/31. Right?
Yes.
Okay. So the numbers I've got written down. Just want to make sure they did.
And just remember that some of those are restricted. It's not all general fund. A good chunk of that's restricted. What did you say, Sherry? Restricted. Yeah.
Restricted, right? Okay. Was the ARPA included in the 19.7?
Yes.
It is included.
Yes.
What did you say? I'm sorry.
Half of the ARPA.
Right, half was a carryover, and there's a new 600,000 that's in there.
And those are things that tap will be shut, that tap will be shut off, we all know. It's not, you can't base a budget on funds that you expect to have.
Okay, can I ask, am I allowed to ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
If you could just speak on the microphone, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, I'll speak right into the microphone. And this is probably to Dennis again. How much of what we're spending this upcoming year in the mayor's proposed budget is one-off money? In other words, whether it's resurfacing, whatever. How much would you say is one-off versus recurring?
Well, for sure, the use of ARPA monies would be a one-time.
Right.
because We don't have any guarantee that the federal government is going to understand.
No, what I'm trying to say, I'm not actually asking for the revenues. When you talk about expenditures, I should have been more clear about that. Talking about expenditures, some of these are one-off things, whether it's the recycling bins, whether it's resurfacing or sewers, etc. Do you have a sense of how much that is? In other words, the non-recurring expenses.
The capital budget that's being proposed is about $1.3 million. Some of that, again, there are commitments that have already been approved in prior years from units for lease vehicles, that sort of thing. So those are ongoing. So you'd probably say about 80% of the money that's proposed for capital is probably one-time costs that are year to year.
Yeah, I understand.
Either buy them now or buy them later.
And by buying them later, one of the things that I do, everything gets more expensive. I guess what I'm getting at is that if I were looking at this, and not just looking at it as a straight number, looking at, as a resident who's driven over these streets the past few weeks, they are in terrible condition. Now, there are only two things that people really well, what do they care about? Well, one, they've done very well. The service department's done a phenomenal job of keeping the streets clear. But as soon as the streets are clear, there are some streets on Washington Boulevard, which is a mess. There are Cedar Road, there's a mess. And I just keep wondering, but, if you were asking me, I mean, if I were being asked, those kind of one-off expenses, I spend it now as opposed to waiting, if that's what people want, if you're looking at the budget.
I think I understand what you're saying in terms of one-off.
Yeah.
Recycling the 240,000 is definitely a one-time spend. There is nothing else here that is a one-time spend, because let's say we have 500,000 in the streets here right now. Every year we do streets.
I understand that.
We have 5 salaries
Is
here.
the mayor suggesting that we do more than 500,000 this year?
The mayor has the 800,000 for the Cedar Road and 500,000 for 3 streets.
If you ask the residents, or as a resident, that, in my mind, is a one-off. And if you can spend it now before everything goes up even further, that's, if you ask people, that isn't. I can understand looking at the eco issues. I can understand looking at garbage pickup and the like. But what I don't understand when you look at this budget, this is money we have now. And if you ask the average citizen how they want it paid, how they want it spent, oh, they don't want the other guy's street to be fixed. They certainly want theirs. But the point is that I think where we know things are going to be more expensive and we have the money now to do it, I would do it. I mean, these are tough decisions and you obviously have to make them, but that's why people are elected.
Just as like devil's advocate, things are extremely expensive right now. Supplies,
They're not going
streets,
down. They're not.
that could be debated, that they're not going down. I mean, you still
Also,
don't
a
have
lot
a
of-
full
a lot of things
workforce.
A lot of things are inflated because, a lot of things are inflated because of the pandemic, with the supply
I
chain.
mean, who would think that we would recover like we have in the housing market after 2008? And now the properties are just valuing like unbelievably. So things do go in cycles, including costs of materials due to pandemic, the supply chain. I don't think it's going to be like that forever.
Additionally, the things like the bins, it's not just the bins. You have additional employees being hired that, salaries and
Well,
benefits.
what I'm
We need
trying
to clear that up. The additional employees are not for recycling. I know Mr. Rock said that in the statement, but that is not what we need the additional employees for. We need the additional employees because we have maintained and continue to maintain, and the council is committed to continuing to maintain backyard rubbish pickup. We did a solid waste study. I talked about it in 2019. Council agreed to do it in 2019. We finished it up in 2020. One of the reasons that we did that was to address the labor issue in the service department. We did not hire people in the service department in 2016 when we expanded the work of the service department by adding more in the community parks. We didn't.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Thank you. And the need for the additional people in the service department is basically an acceptance that we're going to continue to have rubbish pickup in the backyard. Mr. Rock's addition in the study about recycling on the curbside is not the kind of parts that we're dealing with here. That was for bins that he was suggesting. That's something that we looked at, was part of the study, and using these small bins that are kind of like the size of a clothes basket was not recommended by the consultant. That is what Mr. Rock had studied. It wasn't for the kind of recycle carts that we use in Flipper for, and would be operated by the same people that pick pick up the blue bags now when they're gathered on tree lawns after the Kubotas take them down to the tree lawns.
So Mr. McCorney was directly asked in the last couple of weeks what those two service people are for, and he specifically said just for recycling. That question was posed to him very clearly. You know,
That's not the case. And the thing is we need them whether you do the recycling or not.
Mrs. Sachs, you have a question? So I'm still in my orientation period here, and I've been reading a lot and talking to people. One of the things that's fascinating to me is the recommendations from the solid waste study. Several of those don't cost a thing, and we haven't implemented anything. So for instance, the education and awareness is number one. I, for one, am just getting educated this week from everything I've read. So if you put the cart before the horse, if you will, and buy the bins, but don't educate people, you're still going to have contaminated recycling in bins rather than in bags. So there are things that can be done now that don't cost a thing that we can get moving. The second thing is, for example, the routes. The routes have not been reviewed since 2004. And perhaps there could be a redistribution of how trash is picked up, whether it's backyard or curbside. It could make more sense and perhaps relieve some of the workload that's not evenly distributed on the service people. There are several things here that don't cost a thing that we could get moving on with recycling. One of the things that I don't know what the word is, but I hate to say resentful, that it's been a finger's been pointed at council for not wanting to recycle. And that is not true. Council wants to recycle. Council wants to be sustainable, whatever that means, but in a way that is fiscally responsible. And much of what Mr. Rock said makes perfect sense. The study also, which is the number one recommendation of the solid waste study, the survey, it has to go out. We have to understand what the taxpayers really want. There are people who speak up, but the squeaky wheel isn't necessarily the majority. We just have to find out what that is. Maybe it is the majority. We need to hear from them. Maybe they have creative ideas also that are cost effective. So I know I don't want to take away more time from the whole budget discussion, but speaking to that issue, I think that there's a lot more here that need to be addressing, and I plan to address in the service committee going forward.
Thank you.
Well,
Go ahead. I just asked, I want to make sure I heard this correctly. Our reserve policy is to be at year end $2.5 million. Is that correct?
15%.
It's 15% of the general fund.
Yeah, the reserve policy only applies to the general fund.
Okay.
So it's based on 15% of the prior year's ending revenue. So roughly, if you take the numbers from last year, our projected reserve this year would be $2.23 million. That can't be touched unless council.
At year end 2022, 2.23 million.
Well, the 2.23 is the amount that is basically untouchable. It's restricted out of the general fund. So while we're starting the year with $5 million, we're bringing in 15 in the general fund. So we can only spend 18 of that to stay within that.
So if I heard correct, is if we did everything in the revised administration budget set tonight, we would still be in a positive cash position of about $1 million as of the end of this year.
You were, the way the numbers flow, were the ending balance would be slightly over $3 million. So that's about $790,000 above what the reserve would be, technically for the whole year. Okay. But again, it's only the general.
Right, I understand.
And Brad, the numbers that are worked out here take into account that $700,000.
I just have only one other comment. one comment that was made, because Mr. Rock made it, he's not here, obviously, to defend himself, is that you see no need for a planner because we're completely built up. Well, we're not the only urban suburb on the planet where everything, quote, built up. I mean, we're seeing changes going on Warrensville Center Road, Green Road, Taylor Road. We're seeing housing changes in our neighborhoods. I look at the mess at University Center and say, well, was that well planned, And so the problem I see is that cutting the planner might be penny wise and pound foolish. Because on the one hand, you say you want to plan for the future. On the other hand, you don't want to hire somebody who may have the skills to get us through that. I mean, Manhattan is completely built up. It was built up 100 years ago. It's changed completely. Our city is changing. Now we can decide how it's going, is it going to change in a planful way, or is it just going to change whatever? I'm not against change, because I think when we stop changing, we die. So, I mean, that's not my point. My point is that, and I agree with the council that you need to plan. So one of those things, and I don't know where you find the money or don't, is that it may very well be that one of the things we need is a good urban planner.
See, thank you always for your thoughtful comments. I think a plan might be needed maybe after the zoning code redo, when we actually have a plan on how everything, everything looks. Mrs. Weiser, you have a question?
Well, no, I got a comment. You can get planning services that would address the needs of what we have, and it may turn out to be a lot cheaper. And it's not an ongoing person into the next budget. The county used to provide that service where you could use them for planning. What I'm hearing is it's the song again, here we are again, here we go again, is a lack of willingness on the administration's part and council's part to really sit down and flatly say over the next 5 years, this is what we need to do. We're exactly where we were when we went and asked Mr. Brennan to run for mayor. Because we had a mayor that wasn't doing the streets, but only minimally, and was building up that reserve. But there wasn't any planning being done between the council and the mayor. The residents elect the council to do a certain job. They elect the mayor to do a certain job, and we expect you to work together. In other words, both of your egos need to get out of the way. It's counterproductive for the city of University Heights. It is counterproductive to what each of you said you wanted to do when you ran for council and ran for mayor. It is time to stop it. You are adults. You have a vision. Wonderful. We all have visions. Mrs. Sachs is right. You get out there, you talk to people. Not everybody agrees with the mayor. Not everybody agrees with council. But what we do agree on is it is time to stop it and begin to pull the city together. That means you need to compromise, Mayor, and council needs to compromise as well. But it ain't happening. And you're going to take everything that was good about the city and you're going to run it down into the trash. And that's what we were elected to do. That's not what they were elected to do. Yes, money today is worth more than money in the future. Net present value is a great little tool. You use it to determine courses of action. That money, I have no idea why what Mayor Infeld's vision was for that money. But it was there when you came into office, Mayor, because I was sitting in the finance committee meetings where we finally managed to find out what was in investments. And it was there well before you became the mayor. It's there. What a bonus you left. If we plan for it and do something with it that's positive, but it can't only be one thing. Please, don't waste your time. Start working together.
Thank you, Ms. Watson. And
One of the things that, from my perspective, this being the first budget that I'm looking at, it really is, as a snapshot, it's hard to tell what the ongoing implications are of this snapshot. And having come from an institution for 20 years, learning college, that had no money to spend anywhere, one of the things that became very, very helpful was to stop just creating one-year budget. If there was even if it were ahead of a strategic plan, a second year out to say, you know, what's the ongoing 2023? It's really hard to be able to tell not only what would be one-time expenses, but what are the one-time revenues in here. So, you know, the recurring revenues, one-time revenues, some things that are sort of replaceable, but to be able to separate, you know, if this budget were to be approved, what's your starting point for 2023? Because that's ongoing versus, okay, now, but things like the streets, yes, you spend on streets every year, the amount you spend, you can pick. And so, excuse me, maybe if there's this, you know, an extra source that can be dedicated to that so that you can kind of get ahead of some of the street stuff, fine, you can see where that is, but it's almost more like a sources and uses of funds view rather than an income statement, because without a balance sheet to be able to see what's going on, even the cash statement becomes really hard to be able to tell what's really going on. And I know I can't tell, looking at the line items, seeing things in different places, how much of it is recurring versus one time. And even being able to look at a 2-year snap, a rolling 2 years, which is what college has moved toward, to be able to start to say, okay, what are the future implications of the decisions I make today, even in absence of full strategic plan? Would make it a lot easier, I think, to be able to say, okay, are we comfortable starting to eat into what I think the mayor would call the excess reserve, but knowing that, okay, we're getting close to what the reserve would be, how much of that would get eaten in a carryover 2023. That's what it's hard to tell, and I think puts people in their corners.
yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, just as a little background. So we started a subcommittee of this finance committee called Strategic Planning Committee last year. And we got so far as to have a 5 to 10 year capital asset plan, which is done already, which I'm probably happy to forward to you. You know, Chris and I have talked about starting it up right after the budget process again to do exactly what you just said.
Because it'd be a lot easier to interpret and make a judgment
100%.
on this if there was even one more look that says, okay, here are the revenue sources that are going to go away.
Yeah.
Here are potential revenue sources. Here's the baked in piece. And so here's what because right, what I'm hearing are a lot of arguments about what happens to that baseline reserve. And you can't see into the future because there's so many moving pieces with the 1 year snapshot.
Yeah, sorry. Where is that coming from?
I appreciate Ms. Weiser's comments. I appreciate Ms. Arthur's.
Sure.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks. Your comments as well. I appreciate, Vice Mayor, what you said about you, council person, you kind of wanting to immediately initiate that strategic process after the meeting. I think what we're all drilling down on is this idea that year after year, we get into a budget cycle conversation where we're dealing with grand vision in a less than 3-month process. And that's not healthy for any organization to try to achieve large strategic goals in a very short period of time. Because all it does is create this powder keg effect where it's all or nothing and then we're done. And what we haven't done an effective job at, I know we've tried, but what we as council haven't done an effective job at, is to continue that process afterwards with an intent to revise, with the intent to engage with the administration about where these different strategic visions align with our long-term budget. And if it's a 2-year rolling, or it's a little bit of give and take, at least we continue that conversation. I'm committed to reducing the budgets in the ways that we've discussed in the immediate term. I'm unwilling to invest $250,000 plus labor in revising recycling with curbside bins until the survey is done. I'm unwilling to put a city planner in while in the midst of having a conversation about the facilities and zoning and what our grand needs are within the city. I think we all see that the city is changing. I think there are going to be big plans and big changes, and we discussed some of them in various council meetings throughout the past few months. But I think if we take that and take some of the studies we received, a month ago, later this month, we're going to talk about facilities. We're getting zoning done. Then we're going to be able to apply that in a longer term vision. And to Ms. Weiser's point, I think that we are committed to working together to aligning for the long-term strategic health of the city. So that's my commitment and that's my goal.
Thank you, Mr. Gold. Okay, yeah, sure.
Just because there's a lot of new people to this process, just wanted to give everybody some background, so maybe it's just background. City has 5 funds that are basically restricted for what we can spend money on. Fund 200 is the street construction, maintenance, and repair fund. The revenue from that fund comes from license, registrations, vehicle titles, and the estimated taxes. By state law, you can only use that on anything related to fixing roads, improving roads, building roads in your community. So it's not like if you don't spend that money, you can use it for the facilities improvement. It's not, you can't use it. Fund 201 is a sewer and maintenance fund.
Getting closer.
That council approves every year assessments to go on the residents' property taxes, and those proceeds come into that fund. But it can only be used on repair and maintenance of the sewer infrastructure program of the city. Fund 202 is the shade tree maintenance fund. That again is funded by special assessments. You can only use that money related to projects for tree improvements, tree canopy, pruning trees, that sort of thing. Fund 203 is a street lighting fund. We can only use the proceeds, again, that's a special assessment. We can only use those monies to pay for the street lighting bills from the city. And Fund 401 is a capital fund. Those prior 4 funds that I mentioned.
Oh, yeah, don't want something else. Because I can't get the audio work.
Of what the tax money came in for. Fund 401 is a capital fund for any capital improvements related to sewer and water. Now, when you add up all the balances of those funds at the end of last year, we said earlier that the ending balances for all funds was $9.8 million. $3 million of that balance was for those 5 funds. So when we're talking about what can be used for the future and what we're deferring, everybody has to comprehend the fact that you're limited on what that $3 million can be used for. If you don't spend it, you can't say, okay, we're going to build a building, we're going to pay salaries. It can only be used for the purpose that the tax was assessed. So we're proposing in this budget to spend that $3 million. And it's, again, the bigger projects relate to timing, when we get the revenue, when the project will be engineered, that sort of thing. That's just a little background so everybody knows that of all our funds, you know, the one that everybody really looks to as a measure of a barometer of financial health is your general fund. And that's why the financial reserve policy applies to the general fund. Because it's discretionary to be spent on it. So, and there's other funds that we have, a number of smaller funds. But again, with the ARPA money comes in. That was recently, as I said, the restrictions were lifted, so we could spend that money on anything. Prior to that, there were certifications that we were limited to in terms of use of that money. But $3 million of the $9.8 million we ended up last year is all unrestricted funds that have restricted.
Thank you, Mr.
Mr. Kennedy, is there a risk to carrying excess money in those restricted funds?
Well, there's a couple of risks. One is that if the money that you're holding doesn't grow as fast as inflation, then you've lost the money in terms of potential use. It's an opportunity cost. Secondly, there is an obligation. I came from the county. We looked at everybody's budgets. All cities, villages, school districts had to file their budgets with the county budget commission. And the duties of the county budget commission are to verify the revenue estimates of whatever political subdivision submits a budget, compare that to the projected expenses, and make sure they're reasonable. Otherwise, the appropriations are returned to the political subdivision to adjust. The risk to that is if you don't spend the money that you collect, you run the risk that somebody can complain or file a suit and say, hey, you know, you have no obligation or responsibility to tax me because you're not spending. Those are special assessments is not to accumulate resources. It can be to protect you, particularly with sewer and water maintenance, because those are major things when they happen. But to hang on to the money is contrary to what the principle of taxation is supposed to have been used for the money. So those are the two things that we're instituting.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. I just want to make us only with these last two questions, and then we're going to start getting working budget. Yeah.
So for those 5 restricted funds, which totals $3 million, is there, I'm looking at the spreadsheets, you know, are we have $3 million in expenses currently, or is it? I'm sorry, thank you. So with those 5 restricted funds, the total is $3 million, correct? And there's
That was the ending balance.
ending balance. Okay, and we have $3 million in projects in the proposed budget.
Yeah, in the street maintenance budget, we're projecting an expense of $1.1 million. In the sewer and water maintenance, we're projecting an expense of $1.1 million. But again, it includes over $500,000 that we received the revenue from liquid water. We're going to spend $360,000 for shade tree maintenance, $225,000 for street lighting. You know, if you go down to the sewer and water capital improvement, it's about $193,000. That total is roughly around $3 million.
And then it was $9.8 million. There's reference to that one.
That was the total, all the individual fund balances.
Okay, all right, but the $3 million is restricted.
The $3 million is in restricted use.
Okay. And then based on your experience with the county, it would be to spend the money rather than if somebody were to become aware that it was not being spent, questions may be raised at that point.
Well, I'm saying there was always a potential for that.
Right.
There's nothing wrong with accumulating resources for larger projects that you're going to do. But in terms of defer, I mean, I again, this is a personal experience. We had to have some frank discussions with some communities because they were not spending the money that the taxpayers are. Why do you file special assessment against me? Why do you file property taxes? You're not gonna stop them.
And Chris, none of the adjustments that we've discussed
Yeah.
touch those restrictions, that's all being used.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, thank you.
Sharon,
All I
on
was
this
gonna say
topic?
is this, that addresses, Mr. Warthime's concern. It will be spent on the streets in this manner.
Yeah, but,
It's not a problem, it's not being adjusted.
Not you.
I
oh,
said.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I mean, my concern, you know, yeah, I've worked in the nonprofit field and in the government field. You can't, and, you know, it's similar to the for-profit field, you cannot treat, a public budget is different than a nonprofit budget. I don't care whether you're the Cleveland Clinic or a neighborhood settlement house. There are different rules around it, there are different accounting rules. I am concerned exactly about that we don't spend this money for things, and that's why I was interested in what I called the one-off expenses. You know, on the other things, you guys can argue till you're blue in the face, but I think these things, especially infrastructure needs, there's been a real problem in this country of kicking infrastructure needs down down the road for somebody else to deal with or to plan to deal with. And I just worry that we have held off on some of this for so long that this gives us a chance to catch up.
Yeah, and again, Steve, none of the adjustments touch the restricted funds in the infrastructure piece, so. Okay, so.
One question for Dennis. So we had new labor agreements negotiated with a lot of the back pay, or how much the ball number of back pay for 2021 is in the budget for
3.5%, that's what you mean?
It was 3.5%, so I feel like we spoke about this was about 300,000 for each department, or 300,000 in total.
Yeah, I'd have to take a look at that too. We did cover the retro pays in 2021 for the fire department. We have to do the retro compensation adjustments for the service agreement and for the police, the 2 police contracts in 2022. So that's, if you look at a straight salary comparison, that's why they're significantly higher this year. We're going to have to pay for last year and this year, and they get another 3.5% in July.
Okay.
So I just wanted to, having an idea of what that is, and that also.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah, thank you, Brian. Okay, so before we go through a couple of the items as adjustments, so we can move this along and approve this for our council vote. I just want to say a couple of things. Budgets can always be amended during the year, and we have amended them. And if something comes up or we feel that there's a need, we can amend this during the year. We have a retreat coming, so I'm hoping that we can have a shared vision going forward, which is what I think everybody wants. I did ask in the last meeting to sit down with the mayor and go through the budget, but was not contacted for that. Another piece is the strategic planning is so important for any organization, and it must be continued, as Mr. Gould said, and other people have said. So we have that outlook and we have the planning set, so we're not in these crunch times going forward again. Okay, so one thing, and when I was speaking to everybody, and I do want to have some discussion, if there's any comments, is that this committee is prepared to do some deficit spending. We do realize, as Mr. Kennedy said, that if you look at this budget with cash and everything, there's a potential of a $600,000 to $700,000 surplus at the end. And that is taken into account in that. The first piece of, so right now there's a $3.4 million deficit when you look at the revenues and the expenses. So we have a $1.2 million carryover. So right away, that's the Trademark and that's the ARPA funds from last year. So right away, you're down to $2.2 million of deficit. We have some expense adjustments, and Mr. Kennedy, if you can write these down or I can email them afterwards as well. Not to hire the 2 service people, that's about $140,000. Not to hire a city planner, that's about $53,000. Not to hire a senior coordinator, that's about $15,000. And I do believe a senior coordinator can be rolled into a current staffing person, so that they can have their monthly meetings again. I think that is very doable. We feel that the law department is overstated for about $50,000. We feel building and maintenance throughout all of the different departments also can be lowered, about $50,000. IT right now is inflated. We are hopefully having a tech advisory committee meeting for help in March. And realistically, nothing is going to get done and approved probably until April at the earliest. So that can be lowered, not just that main IT, I think it was 180,000, but there's IT everywhere in all these different departments. So in total, IT can be lowered $100,000. And then the $240,000 bins also should be adjusted out of the budget. Now, that is not to say, again, that we meet in committee and have a solid plan on how this looks citywide going forward. When you have all of that together, that lowers your deficit to about $1.1 million. We said we would deficit spend about $500,000, so you're down to about $500,000 deficit spending. We know that we have those funds available, so we will not cut the $500,000 in roads, which I think that everybody agrees to. So there are 3 roads with curbs that are still in the budget. I think this is more than a compromise, than frankly, I'm even comfortable with, but I think that it needs to be done. I also do feel that there are other grant opportunities that will come throughout the year. The police have already mentioned that they probably will get a grant for some of their equipment, a very substantial grant. And there'll probably be other grants coming in built-in housing. So I think this is a good compromise. I think it is an effort that this committee, the advisory and the finance committee have worked tirelessly on over the last month, trying to figure out how to make this city sustainable going forward, because you cannot keep using operating funds from savings. So before we, take a vote on this, I want to have comments from the committee or the advisory committee.
The only thing I would say, Mrs. Weiss, is, and I've
Please.
heard you say before, we cannot continue to do this. These are 1-year budgets. Because the mayor proposes something for fiscal year 2022, that's a deficit spending of $3.4 million. It has nothing to do with what he might propose in 2023. So to me, the comment that we cannot continue to spend whether we take in year after year is rather disingenuous, if you don't mind me saying so. I don't think it's accurate. This is a one-time budget. And as my colleague to the left made a comment, is it's sort of a use it or lose it type of mentality, perhaps at times we need, when if you went to most citizens and said, hey, University Heights is going to have at the end of 2022 $2.5 million in the bank, this and that, and so they said, wow, and, we can't get that taken care of. I don't know, it bothers me a little bit to hear that comment about we can't continue to deficit spend. These are one-time budgets. That's my view of it.
No, I'm glad you mentioned that. And there's two things. One is the strategic plan. They're extremely important going forward. But number two is also, we know we have very large expenses coming up that are not in the budget for facilities. Where's that money coming from? We don't have cash on hand. Engineering costs could cost $2 million alone without blinking.
Right.
We're not gonna take a loan out for engineering costs.
Why? I'm serious. There are no borrowing rates that may not be a bad idea to take over. I would defer to the experts over here, the finance director, to say whether that's an intelligent move or not, rather than just say, carte blanche, we're not going to take a loan out.
So I'm just saying that's a strategic planning issue. It's a finance committee issue that, and there's finance committee meetings throughout the year. So these are things that will come up. The other thing that I did want to mention is that Mr. Kennedy, I'm not sure if the mayor, Mr. Kennedy said that the ARPA funds are going to be used for the Cedar Road project. So that has to be, I'm not disagreeing with you, but it has to come back to this committee and then get referred, because the committee already approved something different. So I think that has to come back into committee just to get it approved.
If that we had, I'm sorry, that we discussed that at the last council meeting because I have March 4th deadline to put the money in escrow.
March 1st. March 1st.
I didn't, it wasn't clear to me that was the ARPA funds were being used for that. I don't know if that was the only one.
Well, the ARPA funds can generally be used as backfill for general revenue. So it doesn't matter whether we say it's for the roads or for something else. At this point, there's a $10 million under the ARPA final rule. There is a $10 million provision of which we're only doing ourselves about 1.3, 1.4 million, because that's all the ARPA.
That's right.
So well, 10 million. And we can basically use it on anything. So whether we're saying it's for Cedar Road, or whether we're saying it's for wages, or whether we're saying it's for legal bills, it can be for anything. So it's not like we have to make a specific decision about it in the ARPA money. We just have to make a decision on Cedar Road and have the money in the escrow account by March 1st.
Sure, I understand that. I'm just saying we should have we're going to have more time on something, so that should be discussed.
Are you suggesting, Vice Mayor, that the plan that this committee came up with and then sent to council for the ARPA money, if you're going to do something different than that, you just need to make that clear on the record, that now we are spending, instead of this plan with food bank and these sort of other things, that's not happening. And instead, we're spending it on Cedar Road. It just needs to be clear.
That's exactly what we need to do. That's all I'm saying.
Okay.
And to the point that we have strategic planning done, and that it is a crucial piece. I think everybody agrees that so that we're not in this position every year, and we are. We had a budget cycle a few years back where it was proposed at $1.5 million, and then it was 3, and then this year it was 4.5 or 5, and then we're in this position where we're having to whittle away at an unrealistically proposed spend. The strategic planning is crucial, especially for a city as small as we are with such limited revenue streams. We cannot compare ourselves to other communities who are 1.82 square miles. And there's a lot that we have to provide to all of our residents who, whether we're small or large, need those things or deserve those things. We have to do it strategically, and we have to do it prudently.
Vice Mayor?
Yeah, that's right.
I really appreciate that comment. I think the statement that was made about being set to your corners, right, as an policy, right? The things that push people there, it's when there isn't a clear view of what's going to happen next, what shoe is going to drop next. So when we approved in our budget last year, police cars using 2 3-year-old estimates of how much the costs were, and then it came time to spend money on the police cars, and it's like, well, the contract that was out when you were budgeted wasn't used to put those numbers in. That's a shoe shine. When we find that the individual who had needed to take an online class wasn't there, and the process of Cedar Road is now going to be hundreds of thousands of dollars more. It's a shoe drop. There's an explanation for it, but they're just instances where our city has these surprise instances of spending a lot more money than we intended to. And so when we plan that out, have a strategic vision, have an idea of what's coming up ahead, I think that the appetite for spending down some of that money will increase. Because in any organization, when the individuals who are responsible for spending that money or authorizing that money don't feel confident in the either long-term vision or the accuracy of those numbers, then they're not likely to spend. So I just think that would be very good.
Okay, so, I want to make it very clear to this committee and to the administration that council very much wants to share that vision and would love to do everything. I mean, that's, we are elected to, and we want to serve for altruistic reasons for the residents. And, the state of the finances are unfortunately, not robust at this point. And I'm hoping that strategy can give us insight into how to better spend smartly, thoughtfully, and intentionally. And we can do that together with the administration, with that shared vision. I'm hoping the retreat will unite us going forward with that vision also. So going forward, I just want to take a vote to move this to go to a council vote. If the two finance committee members would say aye, I'm making a motion to send this to council with the changes that I stated out loud. I will review it with Mr. Kennedy tomorrow as well.
What are we exactly voting on?
The adjustments that I just stated and then forwarding it to council for a vote.
The adjustment that you just went through, is that correct? Okay, we're voting on that. Is it correct?
I'm sorry.
We don't vote.
We don't.
My own quick comment is, it would have been nice to have seen this before the meeting, even as on an advisory level.
So we did send out, I'm not sure if you saw, I'm trying to think if it was sent out to the advisory also. But
I looked at what I got.
Anytime, Steve, you're welcome to call me, and that's my, I will make sure that anything going forward will get to the advisory committee too. I thought that's it.
So the finance committee members who are not council members do not get to vote on this, is that what you're saying?
They vote in council.
We do or do not get to vote?
The advisory
We
committee,
do.
our advisors. So this is the dialogue that we have during meetings or emails, phone calls. The finance committee, made up of council members, vote to send it to council for a full council meeting.
She says so.
It sort of makes me, I'm happy to be on a committee, but it strikes me as rather odd that you have people on a committee who don't get to vote on moving the thing forward.
You're our expert advisors. Not the first year.
Well, I just find it odd, Okay.
And then you get to vote.
All right, thank you. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Can I ask a quick question? We're third of the way through February of 22 in this one. Why don't guys in September submit the budget?